Have you ever considered how fortunate we are to live in an age where medical science has advanced so much and continues to advance at a very rapid pace? I mean, if we had been living back in Darwin's day, about 150 years ago, we wouldn't have antibiotics and vaccinations or even anesthesia. Not to mention that we wouldn't have really any good understanding about how living things work, from their DNA, their biochemistry, cell biology, and organ physiology. There's no question that modern medicine has been hugely successful, and the insights from sciences like molecular genetics, immunology, neurobiology have shed light on the mechanisms behind many of the afflictions that cause human suffering and are a testament to the power of the scientific process. But there is one area of science that, while critical to a good understanding of modern medicine, seems to be largely neglected, and that is the area of evolutionary biology. And like the other sciences already mentioned, it can be used to help answer questions about why we are susceptible to disease, injury, and even aging and death. Evolutionary medicine can be used to answer the why questions by looking back at our long evolutionary history, stretching back all the way to the beginnings of life on Earth. It can not only give explanations for our strengths, like our big brains and our relatively long lifespans, but also to our vulnerabilities as a species. Why are we prone towards danger during childbirth? Why do we have chronic back pain? And why do we sometimes choke on our food? Hey guys, I'm Rich Feldenberg. I'm a pediatric nephrologist, and I create videos about science and medicine. In 2019, the pre-pandemic days, I attended the International Society of Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health Conference in Zurich, Switzerland. It was really fascinating to see research on how our big brains evolved. Brains that are capable of discovering the mysteries of the natural universe, learning about the never-ending war we have with certain microbes, and the millions-year alliances we have with many other microbes, and our delicate psychological systems and its susceptibility to mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, and addiction. So what is evolutionary medicine? Well, evolutionary medicine is simply taking into account evolutionary principles when we consider our human biology. It looks at our long, specific evolutionary history going back through deep time as a way to account for the susceptibilities we have based on our anatomy and our physiology. Now, modern medical science has been really good at coming up with the proximate causes for disease processes. But an evolutionary cause can also be very helpful in understanding why certain diseases are so common in a population, or again, why we are all susceptible to falling victim to certain types of illnesses or injuries. So a proximate cause tells you the underlying mechanism behind a specific disease process. So for example, heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States. And we understand very well what happens when someone has a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. There is atherosclerotic plaque that builds up in the coronary arteries. There could be a rupture of the plaque, inflammation, thrombosis, and a blockage of the blood flow through the coronary artery. And so the heart muscle loses its blood supply and the cells die off. That's a myocardial infarction. But looking at that question from an evolutionary perspective, we might also gain some insights as to why we're so susceptible, why this is the #1 killer in the United States. We know that we have easy exposure to high-fat foods and salty diets, and that leads to high cholesterols and high blood pressure and the processes that advance atherosclerotic heart disease. If we were to look back at our evolutionary history even further, we might see that there are certain constraints on the mammalian heart, the way it evolved in the very early mammals. Sure, it might be really great if we had a more robust vascular system to our heart, so that even if one small vessel got blocked off, maybe the heart would have redundant blood supplies so that that area of muscle would be well protected. But because those early mammalian ancestors evolved the coronary arteries the way they did, we can't go back to our embryology and change that through natural selection very quickly. So that brings up one of the processes that evolutionary medicine can shed light on. And it has to do with the mismatch we have between the environment in which our genes first evolved and the environment which we find ourselves living in today. Our genes were not able to keep pace with the rapid change in our environment due to culture and technology. So hundreds of thousands of years ago to millions of years ago, our ancestors were trying to survive in an environment where food was difficult to find and there were not concentrated sources of fats and salts and sugars like there are today. Due to our technology, we now have refined sugar, high fat and greasy meals, and easy access to salts, because we still continue to seek out those substances even though they're in an overabundant supply. And our bodies have not yet adapted to having such a high sugar intake, high fat intake, and high salt intake. And that leads to diseases that are very common in our society, like obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. Evolutionary medicine also reminds us that every gene has trade-off. So all the genes that are necessary to keep our bodies alive have some type of trade-off. There's no perfect trait. For example, the genes that regulate our cell cycle so that we can regenerate new cells when old cells die off can also be prone towards transforming cells into cancerous cells. So there's a trade-off between being able to regenerate injured and worn out cells and the susceptibility to developing cancer. Our bodies were evolved to seek out things that helped us to survive through a reward system. Dopamine gets released in our brain so that we seek out things like food and sex and a social network. But it's almost certain that things like obesity, but it's almost certain that our ancestors 200,000 years ago were not obese, did not have type 2 diabetes, and probably only very rarely had high blood pressure. There are a lot more aspects of evolutionary medicine I'd like to talk about in other videos. But one more I'll talk about in today's video is something called the Hygiene old friend hypothesis. And that is a way to account for why autoimmune diseases are so common in today's society and may not have been so common in our ancestors many millennia ago. So what the Hygiene old friend hypothesis is postulating is that in our ancestors we were almost always infected with intestinal parasites. In fact, we co-evolved with these intestinal parasites to the point where the parasites could exist in our guts because they were able to modulate our immune system. And our immune system was always trying to fight off these parasites because, after all, they were parasites feeding on us. We did not actually have a symbiotic relationship with them. But because we co-evolved with them, it affected the way our immune system functions. In the last several hundred years, we've become much more hygienic in our society. And that's a good thing because many serious diseases come from bacteria and viruses that occur in poorly hygienic conditions. But what it also caused was a loss of the intestinal parasites in most of us. So without the intestinal parasites to turn down the volume on our immune system may be more active. And so certain diseases that are caused by an autoimmune response may be very prevalent today, whereas they may not have been when those intestinal parasites were part of our body makeup. And there's actually good evidence for this, believe it or not. It was shown that patients with Crohn's disease, which is an inflammatory disorder of the intestines, and multiple sclerosis, which is a neurologic condition, had in some cases improvement in their symptoms, or at least a lack of progression in their disease when they were actually given intestinal parasites. This was strong support for the Hygiene old friend hypothesis. And it may be that we won't have to all eat intestinal parasites to help prevent these diseases. Once we understand the way those parasites were modulating our immune system, that might provide molecular targets that we can use to design drugs that do the same thing that the intestinal parasites did to our immune system without the adverse effects that the parasites pose to our body. In future episodes, I'll talk about other aspects of evolutionary medicine, like why is childbirth so painful and dangerous? Why is there even human menopause at all when that's not seen in other animals? Why do we think we undergo the process of aging? And why is cancer so common and almost inevitable if we live long enough? So evolutionary medicine helps us to understand not just why certain people develop particular diseases, but why we are all vulnerable to certain conditions, diseases, injuries, and general failures of our evolved body. We are not organisms set apart from our world. We have an evolutionary history that stretches back into deep time, and we have co-evolved with many different organisms, animals, plants, and microbial. Well, thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you back here next time. Thanks for watching.